guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, part 3 of our scale model build. Well, last week I had talked about making the fifth wheel attachment and that sort of thing, and actually that's kind of jumping ahead. I did end up cutting the piece, and you can see it right here, and it was just a simple matter of photocopying the pattern, attaching it to the stock, and then cutting it out on the scroll saw and giving it a sanding. It's not rocket science. But I'm actually going to jump back a page because I went a little too far ahead, and we're going to make some of the other smaller pieces that continue with the frame build, things like the bumper and that sort of thing. There's really not much to tell about that. It's a pretty simple process. I'll explain a little bit about doing the bumper, but one thing I want to show you is how you can get some use out of some of your scrap pieces in order to get thinner stock, because there's quite a bit of 1/16 inch stock that's required for some of these parts, and that 1/16 stock is way too thin for most of the thickness planers. And without a platform to bring it up, which you can do, there is a way that you can get some of that stock with your table saw, and you can do it safely and accurately. So let me show you the method of that. Well, in order to cut thin stock like this, 1/16 of an inch thick on the table saw, you want to have your cut or your good piece on the outside of the blade. You don't want that piece being 1/16 of an inch thick to be in between the blade and the fence. It's just too much of a pain. It's too hard. It falls down in the zero clearance insert. It's just a nightmare. So you want it on the outside of the blade. But how do you cut it? Well, the first thing that you want to do is you want to take your stock and you want to mark 1/16 of an inch here. And you can see my mark here. Now that will get aligned with the outside of the blade. And here you can see where I'm adjusting that and getting it set up. Now, the next thing that you want to do before you make this cut is you want to get your combination square. And lining it up with your miter slots, you want to set it so that it has the proper distance to your stock. You can see that here. Now, what this does is it gives you a reference point in order to set your fence. So after you get that set and locked down, you want to make the cut. And then test it with your calipers to make sure that it is the right thickness that you need. If it's not, make your slight adjustments, readjust your combination square, and cut again till you get the size that you need, the thickness. Well, from there, all you do is once you cut your piece and you have your thickness, then you just slide your fence over until it meets up with your combination square, lock it down, and fire through another cut. Slide your fence over to your combination square, lock it down, make another cut. And you can make as many of these to the proper thickness that you want, all of it on the outside of the blade. You can make it safely and use up some of those scraps that you need and get the size thickness you need for the smaller parts of this model. And here's the beauty of that tip. As long as your combination square is now set at this particular mark, regardless of how wide your stock is that you're running through the table saw, as long as you slide your fence over until the stock butts up against this edge here of your combination square, which you've already set, that off cut, which is actually your good cut, will always be the measurement that you want. And in this case, it's 1/16 of an inch. And regardless, you can use up as much stock as you want and have the pieces as wide as you like, or you just want to trim off and get 1/16, whatever. As long as you keep the combination square set at this measurement, you will always have your reference to be able to cut that 1/16 inch stock. Well, the next piece that I'm going to work on here will be this front bumper. And the front bumper, as we can see here, is two separate pieces. One here being the bottom, and then one being the top or the cap. And it will eventually look like this little picture up here. But I've said this before in this build, and I'll say it again, and you want to work from square stock as much as possible. And what I've done is I've taken a scrap piece of maple in this case, and I have cut the thicknesses of the bumper from the exact same piece, leaving the orientation the exact same way, so that when it gets glued together, it will give the illusion that it is a solid piece. It'll be difficult to see the join in it. And that is one of the keys to making a model or a successful one, and that is paying attention to the details. And in this case, it will be laminating these pieces back together in order to give it the illusion of being solid. So in keeping with the fact that we're going to make this out of as much of a square piece of stock as we can, we're going to cut this to our length, and then the next step that we're going to do will be to cut this groove. And we're just going to do that on the table saw, set the blade height and nibble away at it, use a chisel to clean it up on the inside, and once that is done, we're going to glue this piece back together, and then we can cut the angles, which are right here, and we'll do that after the glue has dried completely. So I'm going to put this together, set it aside, and we're going to move on to some other parts. Well, we've got the pieces for the bumper and they're dried up. We're still going to wait. We're not going to quite cut them or do their profiles just yet, because we need to explain a little bit of this. Kind of a tricky piece to do. But we're going to be working on this fifth wheel section. So as you can see, I've got this piece cut, and I'm having a hard time finding any kind of instructions or any kind of measurements as to how to assemble this particular fifth wheel. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start off by making the pieces. And we've got a couple of the fifth wheel bases here that we've cut. Now, for parts like this that are moving parts, I prefer to use a hard wood, like a maple, and that's what we're making these out of. So we have the kingpin receiver here, and we've got these pieces cut for this smaller section here, which is the rear gusset. I cut one extra in case they get messed up. And we need to cut these little pieces. Now these are a little tricky here. And the reason that they're tricky is because they have a 45 degree, but they also have this funny angle and they're tiny. So again, use as much stock as you can. So what I've done is I have cut the 45 at either end of this piece, and I will use my small parts cutting jig and cut it to its length so that my fingers are way, way outside of that blade. You know, we're going to keep all our fingers attached to our hands here. So the first step that I would do in any of this now is I would drill these holes. So these are the holes I'm going to start with on this kingpin receiver, and they're not, you know, anything that's fancy. It's just a 5/16 hole, and then through the middle here, it looks like a 5/32 inch hole. So we'll drill those, and then we'll move on to marking out these pieces over here, which are our fifth wheel mounts. Well, for these fifth wheel mounts, you can see that they give you very specific dimensions. And all I've done is I've drawn out, using those dimensions as a guide, a pattern onto the 1/4 inch thick stock. I'm going to be drilling my holes first, and the change that I'm going to be making here is that they are calling for a 5/32 inch hole here. Now, from what I can tell, although I haven't found anywhere where they actually state it, they are actually using axle pegs for this installation. But again, I don't purchase these things, so I will be changing the dimension of my holes in these pieces to 1/8, so that I can glue a 1/8 rod in there and still have it free floating in the 5/32 inch hole that we drilled over in the pin receiver. Now, I will round the top, and after the holes are drilled, these will only be cut on the scroll saw, so really nothing that special. So those can get cut. These pieces here are already cut, and we'll just take over here to the gussets, and I'll show you what it is that I've done for those pieces. And again, for the tricky little pieces like these front gussets, I've just used the dimensions that they've provided, and using an Incra rule, I've marked it as precisely as I can, and I will end up cutting those to length and then using a disc sander just to take that little angle off on those pieces. These other front gussets here, or sorry, the rear gussets, chances are this is kind of a bit to sand. I'm not really going to bother with that. I've marked them out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to rough cut them on the scroll saw and then just touch them up ever so slightly on the disc sander. And that should be all of the pieces that I require in order to make the fifth wheel assembly. So when I come back with these pieces, we'll glue it together and I'll show you how it mounts on the vehicle. Gluing the fifth wheel assembly together can be a little tricky, but if you use a couple simple tools to help you, it's not that difficult. And in this case, with the hole through the kingpin receiver and the hole through the fifth wheel assembly are both at 5/16 of an inch, I was able to take a 5/16 dowel and just push it through both holes, which will help us align those holes perfectly. And then by measuring, I was able to use some setup blocks with a spacer here of 11/16 to get us nice and straight against the flat edge here of the bottom of the fifth wheel assembly. So this is clamped up. I'm going to let it sit there and dry up, and then we're going to glue the other parts in place. And it doesn't take long when you're being careful to get the whole fifth wheel assembly glued together. And with these little brackets that we've made and changing the size of the hole in here, we have these pins securely mounted and they will just go in like that. And then when these are glued to our frame, it will allow this to pivot, and I'll just place it down on the bench here. You can see that that will pivot just fine by having the dowel sizes changed a bit. So now that we have that done, you're going to need to scale off the drawing for the measurements of the placement of the fifth wheel assembly, because once again, I couldn't find any place that actually listed the measurements to place it. So scale off the drawing, find the measurement. I'll give you a little bit of a hint, and you'll find it on drawing 1 of 9, and you can scale off and get this thing mounted on the back of the frame. Well, we've got that fifth wheel assembly glued up, and it's now glued onto the frame. We're waiting for it to dry. Just pan away, show you a quick little picture of that here. And now, while we're waiting for that to dry, we're going to work on this front bumper. And this bumper is not a tricky piece. However, what can be tricky and what can fool you, and something that you may miss if you're not used to reading plans like this, is the contours of this bumper. And you can see here, this is the front face of our bumper, and we can see that they've got a front face here, and here we have this angle that goes up to the side. You can see both of those here on the front face. And if you weren't experienced and you didn't know how this worked, you would look here and you would say, oh, there's that angle again. But no, this is the top view of our bumper. So that as well has a profile angling back from the front. So we have one coming up from the bottom edge, and we have another one coming back from the front. And that can make it a little tricky. But all we're going to do, and it's nothing special, we're just going to mark it out very carefully, and we're going to take it over to the belt sander, and we're going to sand it flush, and then, you know, sand out our sanding marks. We could do it on the table saw, but it gets a little tricky with the angles, and I'm trying to show you that there's alternative methods here instead of always jumping to the table saw. So we're going to sand this down to its profile, and then that will be the front bumper completed. And there is the front bumper with its front profile and the bottom profile sanded. And it's ready to be mounted now. There's nothing more to do on this piece. And you can see we're paying attention to that lamination at the top has made it so that it gives the illusion and really makes it so that this is one piece. This now is a solid bumper. And we can mount this, and again, scale off the drawing so that you know exactly how to put it on the front of your frame. And we can mount it. If you're not sure about reading prints, guys, go back in my show and search out print reading, and I'm sure that you'll find the episode where I go through it in detail of how to read through blueprints. I'm sure that's going to help you out. But bumper's done. We're going to get that mounted up. Those pieces are drying up, and I really don't want to mess around with the frame too much now. I'm actually going to leave it overnight and let that dry up so that I'm not breaking pieces off. Now, if you look at the drawings and you're going by the chronological order, it would make sense that you would make the rear fenders kind of thing and the mud flaps and all of that go at the rear axle assemblies. However, from experience, I'm telling you that those pieces are kind of fragile, and if you start adding those pieces now while there's a lot of manhandling of the frame assembly, you will end up breaking them. So I'm going to leave those till a little later on after I get the cab and that sort of thing done. So we're going to move forward with the plans, kind of shoot ahead a couple pages sort of thing, and I'm going to start working on the engine block and the front fenders and the cab. And for that, it's just a matter of a bunch of table saw work. Well, it's time now to work on the engine block, and it is a block. I kid you not. When you look at the plans, you need to pay attention to the dimensions here as far as the largest size. And it looks like the largest height is 2.5 inches. The largest width is 3 15/16. So, and of course the length is consistent at 3 3/4. However, I don't have 2.5 inch thick stock. So I've got a piece of poplar here that is 2 inches thick, and we're gonna have to laminate it to start off with. So when you laminate it, I would suggest keeping the glue joint at the bottom of the engine block. That way, if there is any discrepancies or the glue joint shows, chances are it will be hidden behind the fenders. So a little trick for you guys to keep in mind. So I'm going to laminate this block, and once that's done and dry, we can carry on with that particular part. But up until then, there's not much we can do. Well, a piece this large, shaping it for the engine block can be a little intimidating. But not if you think about it and take the proper steps. We have it laminated here, and I've rough cut it to the thickness. It's actually a little thicker than we need, and it's also a little oversized all the way around by about 1/4 of an inch, to tell you the truth. And the first thing that we want to do with this is we want to cut it to its final length, which in this case, according to the prints, is 3 3/4 of an inch. Now, the natural instinct, now that you have this cut to its proper length, would be to cut the sides to their proper angles and therefore bringing it down to its final dimension. However, if you do that, it will cause you problems because there is a downward slope that is on the top of this engine block. And if you cut the angles of the sides, that means that when you try to cut this top angle, it will be crooked like this, and it will completely change things for you. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to do the slope of this top first. Anything after that, we still have the flat bottom that's square to all the sides that we can cut the other angles at the table saw. So the next thing we're going to do is flip this thing on its side. We're going to mark our slope for this, and we're going to sand it on the belt sander. So if everything went your way and you were sure to check the squareness of your table on your sander, you should have something that looks like this, and it's just a block with the top taper. Well, now it's time to cut those front angles, and as I said, we're going to do that on the table saw. Well, now here at the table saw, I have my miter fence set to 7 degrees, and
the plans actually call it 97 degrees, which I guess depending on where you're measuring from, that could be correct. It would make more sense to me to put on the plans that it's 7 degrees and then you know what the angle is of the cut that you're making. But just to verify it, whenever I have a piece like this where I've laminated and it's taken a while to get it to this state, I like to use a piece of hardboard and test cuts so that I know exactly what I'm doing before I cut the final piece. So I've cut the hardboard exactly the same size as this, and what I've done is I've set the fence and I've cut the 7 degree angle here, and then I checked it against the print to make sure that it is the right angle and that I'm not cutting something wrong and that there wasn't an error listed on the prints, because I've seen that before too. So the other thing that you want to keep in mind is before, when we were cutting this to length, this was a cross cut. However, now we're cutting with the grain. So not across it, but with it to get these angles. So we need to change this blade to a ripping blade, which we've done. Using the proper blade for the proper type of cut really increases the quality of your work, prevents burning, gives you a cleaner cut, a better cut. I can't say enough about it as far as using the proper blade goes. So now that we've got that done, you want to make sure that you've got the bottom, so the flat part, not our angled part that we just sanded, but the bottom up against your fence, and the bottom rather, on your table of your table saw, everything tight in your fence. If you're not comfortable with holding this here, because you are within a couple inches of the blade, if you're not comfortable with that, here's what you do. Get a clamp and get clamps on that and hold it to your fence and get your hands away from it. If you're not comfortable with being within a couple inches, then get your hands away and use clamps. But with that now, we're going to cut our first angle of 7 degrees on the one side of our engine block. And now that we have that one cut, due to the angles that we've cut there and the reference points of our flat parts having to be on the table surface and our back of our engine block having to be against the fence, I actually change what side of the blade my fence is going to run on, so that we can have it nice and crisp and get the proper angle without worrying about it. And it only takes a couple seconds to switch it over, so why wouldn't you? I mean, I've said it before, woodworking is not something that you should ever be in a rush to do. So we're going to set this up. We're going to change the angle to 7 degrees, but in the opposite direction. And once we get that changed, we're going to cut not our block, but we're going to cut our piece of hardboard until we get it to the proper dimension. Once we have that set and done, and we have our stop block set exactly where it needs to be, and we've confirmed it on the hardboard, then and only then will we run through our hood or our engine block to finish up that last angle cut. And there we have our engine block cut with all the angles, the slope in the front, the 2 angles on the sides at 7 degrees. And of course, we've put our lamination at the bottom, as I said, so if it doesn't show, or if it shows rather, it can be hidden behind the fenders. But as you can see here, I've chosen some grain pretty carefully and it blends in rather well. Well, we're not going to glue this on. There's still a lot more pieces that need to be made just for the hood alone. But I just want to point out here the importance of this 7 degree angle. And what the importance of that is that we will be making the fender pieces, and the mating edges that will go against the engine block will be cut at, you guessed it, 7 degrees. So you don't want to be doing this on a sander, only because you won't have the exact repeatability that you will need to get those pieces to mate perfectly. So There is the engine block, and now that that's made, we will glue nothing together. There's still a radius that needs to be routed here of 3/16 of an inch, but we're not going to get into that just yet until we make some of the other pieces, things like, well, the front grille. And unfortunately, that would be all the time that we have for this week to work on the project. Not a lot of progress this week, but yet a lot of finicky stuff, and that's the way these model builds go. The important thing to remember here, guys, is that when you're doing any process during the entire build, it is well worth your while, and you should be doing this with every project, but before you make your cut, check your blade for square to the table on that table saw, check your angles, make sure things are tight, that sort of thing. Always keep in mind the safety aspect of the build as well, where your fingers are in relation to the blade. And for some of these cuts, if you're not comfortable with that table saw being, you know, that close to the blade, we're 2.5, 3 inches away. If you're not comfortable with that, then don't do it. It's as simple as that. There's other ways you can do it. There's sanding, you could set up a miter box, cut it by hand, whatever you like. There's always another way. Never do anything that you're not comfortable with and not secure with. Because rule number 1 in the shop, guys, if it doesn't feel good, don't do it. Guys, I want to thank you for joining me again this week. We're going to continue with the build next week, and I hope you're going to join me for yet another woodworking video.